Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So my name is Marie-Blanche Ting. I'm from the UN Environment Program Copenhagen Climate Center. So today we'll be talking a bit more about governance and institutions for climate technology progress. This work is part of what we call the Climate Technology Progress Report, which was launched last year during COP28. So thanks very much for joining us. We have 3 other speakers today who are part of the report, who will be going into a bit more into the chapter of the report. So today we're talking about governing urban systems transition, how to meet the needs for climate technology transfer, and how can governance and policies lead to an improved mainstreaming of climate initiatives. So the agenda for today, as I said, we have 3 speakers. I will be providing introduction, providing a bit of context to the reports, and the 3 other speakers we have is Dr. Pakamas Thinphanga. She is currently the project director at the Thailand Environment Institute Foundation, based in Thailand, where she leads the Strengthening Urban Climate Governance in Thailand project. Her work focuses on research and understanding urbanization and climate change, vulnerability and resilience, the concepts, and translating urban climate resilience into practice. The next speaker we have is Dr. Subash Dhar, who is my colleague here at the UNEP CCC, and he will be speaking on promoting electric mobility in Asian cities. Dr. Subash is a senior economist here at the center, also a senior fellow at the Global Center for Environment and Energy in Ahmedabad University. And he did lead, he was also a lead author in one of the IPCC chapters, especially the transport chapter, and also a contributing author in the 5th assessment of the IPCC report. And the last speaker we have is Dr. Sumetee Pahwa Gajjar, who will be presenting Governing Urban Systems Transition in a Cape Town case study. And she's a senior researcher at the PlanAdapt Co-ordination Hub and Climate Co-adaptation Lab Fellow. Sumetee has over 20 years experience in research and capacity building domains with a focus on public administration, urban management, and public leadership towards sustainable development. So thanks very much for joining us. Once all the speakers present, we will then come together and answer some of the questions. So please, let's make this as interactive as possible. There is a chat button, so if you do want to provide questions, please do provide questions, but we will come together and answer those questions. So it will be a 5-7 minutes presentation each. So let me start with my presentation. For those of you who are not so much aware of the Climate Tech Report, this is a series of annual production here at the center where we're looking at technologies where are increasingly recognized, at least in the climate change community, that there is a degree to which technologies are deployed, but there are questions about barriers and what are the enabling conditions for the development, transfer, diffusion, and uptake of these technologies, and how can we better understand and document progress. So there is a crucial need for better information of the status, the gaps, and the progress of technology. And in summary, this report that was published last year, so please, there is a brief and there is a report, so there is a chance for you to go deeper into understanding of the report. It is in the center if you want to read more about it. So the series is providing more scientifically credible and policy relevant assessments on different aspects of tech transfer. It aims to deliver information to the UNFCCC process, in particular implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Global Stocktake, and to strengthen information on country action on tech transfer and creating enabling environment. So for our target group for this work is the constituency related to national planners, decision makers, private sector tech providers, and the UNFCCC community. So last year's report 2023, which was, as I said, launched in COP28, so it's very recent in December. The focus of the most recent report is on climate technologies for the urban and infrastructure system. So just to give you about 2-3 slides, I'm providing you context to the reports. As we're talking about urbanization, it is well known that by 2050, about 2/3 of the population will be in environment, so people living in cities and towns. So this is very important because obviously if you look at urban population growth, according to a report from ASEAN report, there is an expected population growth in urban cities around 2%, while the rural population is in decline of minus 1.3%. And even more importantly, in Asian cities, there's also urbanization across rural and urban-rural divide. On one aspect, you have an increase in megacities, but also a very fast, rapid urbanization in so-called secondary cities, where most of the growth is taking place. So this report is zooming in on case studies in Asia, because Asia is known to have a very fast-growing urban population, highly vulnerable to extreme weather and climate change impact. And so, therefore, the question is, we have a lot of urbanizations taking place in these cities where there are good opportunities in raising the standards of living of people, but also this comes with externalities and the impact this has on social and environmental costs. And some of these that I mentioned here and I mentioned in the report is there is an increase in urban sprawl. There's also local governments that are being unable to provide adequate infrastructure to respond to this growth. So that also relates to the implication of housing, public services, and also informal settlements. As with a rapid growing population, there's also a need for water, and so therefore, what impact does this have on water consumption and the implication on shrinking aquifers? And a lot of the cases that we've also mentioned in the report is traffic. As you can probably appreciate in cities in Asia, there's a lot of traffic congestion because there's also this aspirational need to own cars, to own motorcycles, to have private means of transportation. So there's also congestion that can also lead to air pollution and greenhouse gas emission. And lastly, also with rapid urbanization, there's also large amounts of waste, especially having an impact on land, rivers, and lakes. So this is just providing you a context of how technologies can be able to resolve some of these issues, but also to take into consideration that urbanization is very much linked to other parts of issues like biodiversity loss. We're also talking about rising inequality. So as all of this dynamics are changing, we do need to take into consideration that progress of technologies is not just technology itself, but also diffusion of technology in society as well is very important. So this is what we talk about in this report. So today's webinar, just to say that urbanization is linked with other global challenges, like, as I said, biodiversity loss, inequality. And this makes communities much more vulnerable to future climate change impacts. And so, therefore, there is a need to rapidly scale up the implementation of climate technologies and also looking at significant co-benefits, minimizing trade-off, as well as making sure that this implementation is within local contexts. So the webinar today will present cities in Asia, taking into consideration that there are varying characteristics. So hopefully we can provide lessons, insights, best practices of governance and institutional dimensions that are required to develop and implement climate technology. So that's my presentation. I'll hand over to the next speaker. Dr. Pakamas will then talk about cities in Thailand. And so hopefully that will give you some insights into the kinds of barriers and opportunities for climate technology progress. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. So my work is on urbanization and climate change. So we engage with local governments and communities in climate vulnerability assessment and planning and implementing resilience strategies. So what we are trying to do here is basically trying to understand urbanization. So what's driving urbanization, but more importantly, how urbanization is contributing to climate vulnerabilities of local communities. And so urbanization is driving changes in land use. So there's some changes in ecological and hydrological landscapes, but this is changing rural agricultural green areas into urban, which is not, it's not new, it's not unique. I think a lot of cities and countries are going through this process. But the emphasis here that I want to point out is that secondary cities are actually growing without land use planning in Thailand case, but probably quite common in some of the global south cities as well. And so cities are urbanizing into low-lying area, floodplains, and naturally risky areas. And some of the cities been established for a while, and so with growing population and increasing demands, they cannot keep up with urban systems and infrastructure, and some of the existing infrastructure are already old or outdated, and so not working very well. And climate change, basically climate impacts are being felt through water. I mean, it's just simple, too much rain, not enough rain, and then it's just flooding and not enough water. But there are already existing water-related challenges that are being exacerbated by climate impacts, and the impacts of water-related problems as well as the impacts of climate change are being felt unevenly across different social groups in cities. And so the way we are urbanizing cities are actually increasing climate exposure and vulnerability of local communities. So these are some really big issues that I think are quite complex institutional and governance challenges. We're talking about how can we enforce land use planning? How can we provide critical urban systems and infrastructure that are working properly and meeting the demands, and at the same time protecting natural ecosystems and biodiversity? But, I mean, in the face of urbanization and climate change, we need to rethink how we manage water resources, and the same thing for any water-related disasters. That usually, I mean, the normal practice is that it's a reaction, just emergency responses rather than the longer-term planning and thinking through how climate impacts are changing weather patterns, but also contributing to different patterns of like water disasters. But so some of the key things that I think that we need to think about, when we're talking about water, but also when we're talking about institutional and governance challenges, is that we need to look at institutional structure and arrangements, and in terms of power relationship, how decisions and plans, these planning processes and decision-making processes are made by different stakeholders and sectors. The fact that in terms of coordination across sectors, and then a coordination for knowledge sharing and data, and how different institutions have different resources and capacity, and also technologies in this sense. Just to give some background for the government structure and arrangements in Thailand, that we have both local governments and provincial governments working in the same space, same areas, even though they're under the same ministry, but they are under different departments, so they have different sets of rules and plans and regulations and different ways of making decisions. And some of the officials are elected, some of them are appointed by the central government. So, within the same space of working and functioning and administration, then there'll be some political conflicts between the governments, local and provincial. And then when you have different government agencies as well. So in Thailand, we have just over 40 organizations under 8 ministries that are responsible for just water-related management, water planning. And then there are other agencies that are responsible for urban planning, for disaster planning, for policy planning. So, I mean, I think this is, just looking at institutions and institutional structure, there's already some complexity in terms of coordination and working across sectors. And then recently, there's a new national level office for water resources. This is the Office of National Water Resources is now serving as a single command, centralized agency that's supposed to serve as a coordinator for the 40 organizations. But then that means, in terms of making decisions and planning, that would come under one agency. And then there's a new Department of Climate Change and Environment. It's brand new. It's only been established a few months ago, so it's not even effective yet. So just to get into this case study, so I've been working in the south. It's Hat Yai city. I call it Hat Yai urban region because the way the city has grown is one of the biggest secondary cities in Thailand, and it's a gateway. It's a very important economic hub for the south. So the province itself is next to Malaysia, so on the border. So it's a gateway to Malaysia and Singapore. And, but when we look at just the city, so the Hat Yai city, the urban center is in the municipality, but the municipality itself is quite small relatively. And as the region is growing, the municipality is surrounded by other growing towns. So there are 5 different municipalities that are rapidly urbanizing. And in terms of just land use planning, it's a very ambitious comprehensive land use map that includes 26 different local government authorities across 5 different districts. So as an area itself is one of the largest in the country, so the second largest, I think, after Bangkok. So just in terms of just land use planning in itself, the idea that local governments would come together to renew the plan, to update the plan, to enforce the plan is, well, I think there's some challenges in terms of political collaboration, coordination, and I think all the local governments, they all want to be, they don't want to be rural. I think they want to be urbanized as well. So when we talk about water resources, I think we need to look at the scales. I think scales are very important because so for Hat Yai, it's located in this really big watershed, this Songkla Lake Basin. And the watershed itself stretches over 3 provinces. And Hat Yai city is in the downstream area. So you can see all these rivers, waterways from the south and the west of the province, or so the flows, they flow from the south and the west through the city into the lake. So that's the drainage, and so the city itself is low-lying, is located in floodplain areas, and it's downstream, so it receives all the water, which means that it will get flooded anyway, even without climate change. So with the way cities are urbanizing, as I mentioned earlier, that they are filling in wetlands and growing into floodplains and filling in rivers, building roads and infrastructure, blocking drainage and water flow. So it gets flooded. And so natural waterways, if you look at the middle picture, is basically it used to be a canal, is now just a ditch. And so whenever it rains, it floods. But then And this is very common in most of the cities, that the idea is to keep the urban center dry. So what they do, they use water pumps, they divert water, they drain water into neighboring areas, but most of the time it's into basically the poor and informal settlement, so they get flooded all the time. And so Gajjar has had several flood disasters. The latest one was in 2010. The one before that was in 2000. And this is a very serious disaster that most of the city was underwater, and for a few days, for several days, and the flood levels were as high as 3.5 meters. So after the 2000 disaster, the city built several drainage canals, irrigation canals, water pump stations to protect the city. But then in 2010, the flood level was worse than in 2000. So basically, it's issues of urbanizing into floodplains area, and without thinking through changes in ecological landscape and changes in hydrological patterns. So just to get into some of the technologies, as I mentioned earlier, that we have several organizations, institutions, government agencies that work on water. So they all have different methods and approaches and technologies in terms of data collection, knowledge production, but there's very little sharing, collaboration, coordination between agencies. Whereas at the local level, so this is an early warning system. Basically, the way it works is that usually if there's a weather forecast saying that rain is coming or water is coming, someone will have to stand and watch the river to watch the water level, which means local community members will have to keep an eye out for the flag. So if it's yellow, it's just being cautioned. As soon as the flag is raised, it's a red one, then they either have to run away or evacuate, or I don't know if they have, if they can move their belongings to the second floor. But that's just the early warning system at the local level. But then recently, the city itself has sort of put together CCTVs in various hotspots, basically along the waterway, so that anyone can monitor water levels, and they can make decisions themselves whether they need to evacuate or they need to move their belongings or prepare for floods. So this is a way to bypass they don't have to wait for government agencies to make an announcement or to provide early warning. So this is one of the approaches that the local communities can access and make their own decisions. And, basically based on just watching on this website, and then they can estimate and calculate how long it takes for the water to reach where they are or to reach the city. And, so I think this is quite a common practice, that to deal with water resources and to deal with floods, they usually just go for building irrigation drainage canals and using engineering approaches, but with one objective. So it's mainly to protect the urban center. But the way they, I think, how this infrastructure is constructed or built, they usually use past event, so past disaster, or using historical data, and without really integrating climate information, climate data into this calculation. And so under this changing climate, this infrastructure usually just don't work, and then they generate new problems. And so when we look at I think some of the institutional and governance challenges are quite complex. I mean, we still need to look at the social implications, how urbanization is also contributing to climate vulnerability. I mean, I think there's also a question of how can we integrate ecosystem-based approaches into this thinking and planning, but also at the same time, integrating climate information into planning and decision-making processes. So what's missing here is that there's it's the way governments or the way institutions are structured, they're very sectoral. So there's always this connection between this land use and water. I think we just need to, the way we approach urbanization and climate change, that we need to think through, using system-based approaches more than just having sectoral planning and decision making. And so this is my last slide. That I think when we start thinking about technologies for climate adaptation and resilience, I think any technologies that could help or support coordination across sectors, across institutions would be useful, especially looking at these massive scales and boundaries. How can we support institutions to share knowledge and data, and also to support knowledge co-production to be more inclusive, and especially around planning that across scales and across institutions as well. How can we promote inclusive planning and decision-making processes? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pakamas. Very rich insights there, and I think a lot of questions we can ask. But I think we can do it if there's time later. So if I can hand it over to Dr. Subash, if I could also just please ask the speakers to keep to their time. So we're now at 11:30, and we do want to stick to time, so please could you just make sure that we present accordingly. Thank you so much, Subash. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Blanche. And I would be speaking about electric mobility in Asian cities. This is a topic which we touched a little bit in our perspectives reports. And in this presentation, besides the chapter which is in the technology perspectives reports, I also bring in some more insights from some other work we are doing in the Asian countries. Now, when we look at electric mobility, I think two things are coming to our mind. One is that electric mobility is moving in a, you can say now, in a big way across the world. But if you look at the statistics, at the data, we find that there is a very different story between what is happening, for example, in Europe, which is the slide at the top. And here you can see that the share of light-duty vehicles in most of the European countries is more than 10%. In fact, some countries like Norway, they are having market share of more than 70% now. But when we come to Asia, the story is very different. First of all, there is no secular trend that the electric mobility, especially in case of light-duty vehicles, has caught up. If we take out China, especially if we take out China from this picture, then you realize that many countries have a very erratic, you can say, track record in terms of how the electric mobility, especially for light-duty vehicles, has progressed. So what we try to do is we try to look a little bit deeper from some work we are doing in India. So we're currently working on some net zero strategies in the state of Gujarat in India. So we looked at the vehicle, you can say how the vehicle sales have gone up and where is the electric mobility coming in. So as you can see in this slide, a large part of the vehicle population is still based on fossil fuels. It is diesel, CNG, petrol. Battery electric vehicles, however, have made some, you can say, entry. That is the small, you can say, yellow, which you can see after the COVID. After post-COVID, there has been, you can say, growth in the sales of electric vehicles. And in 2022-23 statistics, you can see at least 5% of the vehicles which were sold, or 5% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles. So which is a heartening story to see there, and you can say that yes, so far there was not much traction, but now we are seeing good progress, even in case of India or in the Indian cities. If we look at a little bit deeper into these 5% electric vehicles, you find a story which is a little bit different from Europe. A lot of these vehicles which are sold now in India are electric two-wheelers, electric three-wheelers, a little bit of cars, and some buses. And we'll basically in this presentation talk more about buses because they are very important from the public transportation perspective. Now, looking at why it has been a little bit difficult for electric vehicles to make a business case in Asia, and especially in the case of India, is related to the high capital cost of these vehicles. That is actually a barrier which cuts across different vehicle technologies. The second factor which we found was it is the risks which is perceived. So you don't find it easy to get loans for these vehicles. The third was awareness, which I would say has improved in the last, because this you can say part of barriers is based on a paper we wrote in 2022, but based on the data which is little bit around the COVID time. So awareness was also one of the major barriers, but it has improved since then. Then one of the major barriers for electric vehicles has been also this infrastructure issue for charging. The charging infrastructure is not readily available, and in many cases, even for two-wheelers and four-wheelers, it is not easy to provide your own charging. And on top of that, you also have this issue of electricity tariffs, which are not uniform, and there is a lot of lack of clarity in terms of what kind of electric tariff I would have to end up paying for charging these vehicles. And since the market is still, you can say, finding its feet, you don't have a lot of local manufacturing capacity. So that also contributes towards, you can say, in some sense, towards a lack of capacity, the lack of, you can say, much higher cost for these vehicles. So in case of buses, we basically we are currently doing a case study on the buses, and similar to the other electric vehicles, you find that for buses, the capital cost is the major barrier. In fact, they become a much bigger barrier in case of buses, because buses generally have bigger battery sizes. And because of that reason, the capital cost of buses is even, you can say, 3 to 4 times higher than the conventional vehicle. And this issue of limited, you can say, local manufacturing is even more acute in case of buses. For example, in a country like India, there are two to three manufacturers who are providing these buses. So it creates not only the issues with respect to the choice for these vehicles, but it also creates capacity constraints for these buses. Government of India on its own actually would like to see a lot of local manufacturing coming, and to do that they have imposed like high duties on import of vehicles. So there is this dichotomy that at one end you don't have a lot of local manufacturing, and the government at the other end is trying to promote local manufacturing, but by putting high import duties. But for the end users, it's creating this scenario where you don't have much choice and you have high capital costs. In case of buses, the other factor is that the charging, unlike two-wheelers, four-wheelers, requires depots or facilities where they can be charged. And many cities actually don't have good public transportation systems, bus-based systems, so they don't have depots. So this it also becomes a barrier in some sense. Government has been, and I will talk it a little bit more on it. Government is providing financing through some programs. However, this is excluding the private bus operators who also own a number of buses in case of India. And then finally, your target audience for the government programs are the state transport undertakings and the cities. But both of these entities are not doing a very great job in terms, because cities' financial conditions and the credit worthiness is a question mark. And state transport undertakings are also, a lot of them are making losses, and therefore, for somebody to supply buses to them becomes quite a challenging task because of their situation. Now, this was more about a little bit about how government is trying to incentivize through policies and what has been the achievement in India on that. First of all, if you look at the Indian cities, public transportation, as I mentioned, is not a very big strong point. Many cities do not have even a functioning bus system. So there are very limited number of buses. And under the national or federal, you can say, incentive scheme, which is called the FAME 1, which was introduced in 2015, the government started giving, you can say, financial incentives to the cities. And because of this barrier, what I mentioned about lack of credit worthiness of the cities and loss-making state transport undertakings, a lot of cities did not get any good responses for that from them. So government in 2019 increased the ambition and allocation for this program, and they put a target around 7,090 electric buses under the FAME 2. Once again, when this FAME 2 was introduced, there was some challenges, but it performed a little bit better than FAME 1, especially for the larger cities. Under FAME 1, only some 400 odd buses were purchased, but under FAME 2, more than 2,000 buses were purchased in the first round. But it was still lower than the ambition of 7,000 buses. So the government initiated a program called a Grand Challenge, in which they tried to aggregate the demand for buses across various cities. So previously what was happening, that states and cities were doing their own respective individual tenders. So under the Grand Challenge, government asked a central entity called CESL to float a common tender for the cities. And this was quite a good success, because there were around more than 5,000 electric buses which were purchased under these schemes. And because of these incentives and the kind of activities which are happening, many states and city governments have now also started going beyond the federal incentives and actually try to use their own funds or try to divert the funding from some other, you can say, funds meant for urbanization, like the funds available to the cities under the smart city programs. So in some sense, I would say that now, because of all these initiatives, there is a pickup for electric buses in India. But at the same time, if we take, because we are now trying to assess what has been the success. You can say at one sense there is a success, because in terms of number of buses and in terms of the targets that the government set for itself, they have succeeded. But at the same time, India is a large country. There are a number of cities which is really do not have all the, you can say, a very good public transportation system. Therefore, the success or performance on these schemes of the government, like FAME 1 and FAME 2, has varied across the cities. Cities which have good governance and credit worthiness have succeeded in receiving funding also under the FAME, whereas the cities which were not having, to begin with, a good public transportation system have not been able to get much out of these programs. Okay. The other point, I think, which many cities, or when we were basically talking to people in India regarding the performance of these e-bus programs, was that the cost of these buses, as I mentioned, the cost of these electric buses is 3 to 4 times. Maybe it is coming down, maybe it is 2 times or 3 times only now. But the question for the cities becomes then, should I invest in getting a diesel bus, which is like much cheaper and which can help me in creating a better public transportation system in the cities, or go for electric bus, which is more expensive? So this is one thing. But at the same time, whether cities go for electric buses or whether they go for conventional buses, there is a lot of merit in moving away from private modes of transport, because as of now, a lot of mobility needs are met by personal modes of transport, like cars, two-wheelers, or maybe paratransit modes like three-wheelers. But they are creating problems, as Blanche mentioned in the very beginning, related to congestion, air pollution, and all that. So if the cities can move towards public transportation, then we can use lesser, you can say, space for moving the people, and at the same time, we can also address some of these air quality challenges. And on top of that, if we are able to find a business model through which electric buses could make a business case without, you can say, federal incentives, financial incentives, then we can even multiply the impacts of the public transportation in terms of air quality, and also help in creating more equitable cities, more cooler cities, and also cities which have improved energy security, and active cities, because then you are also promoting trips from walking, cycling, because public transportation also requires access and egress trips, which promote active mobility. With that, I end here. I'll leave you with this three papers which I referred in this particular presentation, and also the authors with whom I have been collaborating on this. And thank you very much. Look forward to questions.
Thanks very much, Dr. Subash. If there are questions, please put them on the chat. Otherwise, we can ask questions after. So if I can hand over to Dr. Sumetee, we do have more or less 10 minutes. So if we can just stick to time, and then at least we can have questions for the other panelists as well. So Sumetee, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentations that came before me. Hi, thanks, Mary. I'm just finding the presentation quickly. Okay, so yeah, I'm senior researcher at PlanAdapt, and we work with researchers, we work as knowledge brokers, we work in capacity strengthening with researchers, and I'm co-principal investigator of the CLARE CS Hub, a large CS program. Can you see my presentation?
I can see your desktop. I think just go back to your PowerPoint. Yeah, I can see it now.
So I think some of the points have already been discussed before, which urban realities that are at the intersection of climate change and unsustainable development. These are images of devastation after a typhoon in Philippines, mother and child in Indonesia. So we know that cities are actually at the nexus of a lot of unsustainable impacts of climate change. They are also crucial for transformation. As we've heard, an additional 2.5 billion inhabitants will be added to the global population, urban population, and 90% of this will happen in Asia and Africa. Therefore, there is a massive increase in demand for urban infrastructure of all sorts to meet the needs of this rising population in urban centers. However, cities are also where the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost. So emphasizing why we focus on them. Cities as transforming from a sustainability problem to a sustainability solution. Yes, we know that cities concentrate risk. They are high emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. They have high vulnerability to climate change driven impacts and extreme events. And as discussed earlier, the impacts of climate are heterogeneous, especially in the global south. So different people experience the impacts of climate change and extreme events differently based on where they are in the social hierarchy. However, cities can transform and meet resilience, climate justice, and sustainable development goals. And this chapter and our work focuses on how that may happen, the process. So what do cities of the Global South face? We've discussed that there are profound environmental challenges, in particular climate change. There's high resource demand, water, energy, ecosystem depletion, ecosystem vulnerability. However, there's also growing scientific knowledge, which is being combined with diverse ways of knowing by the people that live in cities. There is, unfortunately, a deepening socioeconomic inequalities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. But at the same time, there is greater awareness about our collective vulnerability and our interconnectedness. There are old ways of governance, inappropriate for the complexities of urban development in the information age. And at the same time, as this chapter demonstrates, there is a growing demand for innovations and an active need for new ways of governing. In brief, we need to make key urban transitions. And how do we start thinking about change? The presenters before me spoke about how cities and how the sectors of mobility are trying to address challenges such as flooding in Thailand or the lack of take-up of e-mobility among bus and public transport in Indian cities. What we are presenting here is the quadruple helix, which has been adopted by the South African Cities Network in 2016 already. And this is not an example from Asia, but we do believe in South-South learning. We do believe in South-South exchange of knowledge. So what we present here is a model which suggests that innovative approaches occur in a cooperative space, where government, the private sector, knowledge institutions, and civil society role players meet. And this cooperative space can create an enabling environment for systemic changes. However, what is needed is deep or urban systemic transitions, which require strong collaborative commitments from all stakeholders. So without these commitments, a lot of efforts can fall flat. We will look quickly at some approaches that we have uncovered or discussed in different publications and projects. What forms of urban innovations can occur? We've discussed previously in other sessions about climate compatible technologies such as EBA, nature-based solutions, new business model governance mechanisms, transformed regulatory structures. And what I wanted to speak a bit about are new socio-ecological practices. What do these entail? These could be very simply, but very difficult to achieve, the incorporation of social principles for implementing EBA, which helps achieve climate justice for nature and people. So these social principles help us in including people, those who are affected by climate change, in the designing and implementation of solutions. These innovations can include nature-based solutions for flood risk management and circumvent the entrenched urban planning and development patterns of global cities, such as the ones from Thailand we've just witnessed. And at a community scale, project that we worked on with ARA funding is community commons that are shared spaces within settlements, providing environmental, social, and economic support for the urban poor. Looking very briefly and in a very large overview of the Cape Town urban, which tries to balance environmental and development needs, we know that the city has very high levels of informality in livelihood, settlement typologies, unemployment, and there is a spatial fragmentation of the urban fabric, owing in large due to apartheid, a legacy of apartheid and structural inequality. However, the city is also part of international knowledge networks such as ICLEI, the C40, and the Slum Dwellers Initiative. It has also participated in transdisciplinary collaborative research endeavors, such as the Fractal project. And at the same time, perhaps owing also to its colonized legacy, is a high scientific attention to biodiversity hotspot status. In the solution space, we have local residents from across the city, predominantly from well-to-do areas that are organized around custodianship groups for urban nature. However, there's also those from lower economic settlements, which are also similarly organized. There are local government actors that work on flood management, biodiversity conservation, EBA, along with the local actors. And also, there are a sizable number of local, well-established non-profit organizations supporting pro-poor urban farming and food gardening. And this took a big leap during and after the pandemic. So how do we diagnose what works and what needs work in the urban sustainable transition of Cape Town? The city already benefits from a highly developed regulatory framework for biodiversity conservation, urban farming, and these are aligned with nationally mandated policies. There are successes with ecological infrastructure. There are several projects such as the Source to Sea project, dune restoration at various coastal locations, EBA with community participation. However, these are incremental. Since climate-induced impacts of drought, urban floods, and their second-order impacts on especially the poor and vulnerable occur in additional locations where problems such as land tenure persist and basic services are lacking, ecosystems are degraded. So there are heterogeneous impacts that remain unaddressed. Such vulnerable sites and communities require greater cooperation across a range of urban actors, including urban farmers, civil society actors, local government departments, knowledge brokers, and only then can we hope for a deep and systemic change to occur and climate vulnerabilities to reduce. In conclusion, cities can make distinct contributions to the development and diffusion of innovations. Cities can provide spaces for experimentation, learning, and upscaling of climate technologies, as well as nature-based solutions. And for this to happen, knowledge networks are key. They can help facilitate the sharing of ideas, whether it's in the city, whether it's between communities in a city, whether it is from south to south between countries, and then best practices across space and scale can allow innovations to be shared, replicated, and adapted into new contexts. These are the resources that I have used for this presentation and for the contribution to the chapter. Thank you for listening.
So we do have a question from one of the person that attended this webinar. So yeah, if we can just ask everyone to switch on the video. So one of the question is a great presentation. So thanks very much to the speaker. I'm keen to hear about experiences on democratizing urban streets by prioritizing road space for modes used by majority of urban dwellers, such as walking, cycling, mass transport, and having safe spaces for dominant modes also help in adoption in these transport technologies. I think this can go to Subash. This is speaking to transport. I hope you're able to read it, Subash, or do you want me to repeat the question?
I'm not able to read it. That's why I was trying to look where you're reading it from.
Can I see?
Chat, is it in the chat?
It's in the chat. The question is, in terms of experiences in democratizing urban streets by prioritizing road space for modes of urban dwellers such as walking, cycling, mass transport. Having spaces for dominant modes can also help in adoption of these transport technologies.
Yeah, true. Actually, that has been, if you look at cities in Asia, we have really struggled because BRT, for example, bus rapid transit systems, they used to have this concept of having spaces for walking, cycling, along with spaces for giving a dedicated corridors for buses. So in some sense, prioritizing public transportation and active modes of transport. But if you see the implementation of this, the experience with respect to the implementation of these projects, it has not been that spectacular. Because those spaces which were allocated like for walking, cycling, they get easily encroached because they are on the side of the roads. So in effect, you have planned for something, but the implementation is such that you don't really achieve the result you are looking for. Obviously the intention is there, but the implementation has been a challenge, and I don't have any bright ideas on that unless you can say that unless there is the full, you can say, buy-in of the stakeholders or into this, that is also a challenge. And now, for example, if I look at India, a lot of focus has been on going into the direction of large infrastructure projects like metros and all that, because then you don't have these challenges. But at the same time, how do you ensure that there is good access and egress for even if you are putting a metro system in place, ensuring that there is good access and egress for these modes is also equally important. And to some extent it is happening, but it's you can say a long battle, I would say, for transport.
Okay, thank you, Subash. We only have a few minutes left, but if I can ask a question to Pakamas. I think you did mention things like political economy and power relations and decision making. I was just wondering, because this is obviously an interesting topic for me, so there's a lot of decision makings between policy makers, but I'm just wondering what's the role of community, because it has an implication on them as well. So you have these elite people that are making decisions. How does you get society to come in and actually participate as well in these decisions? Because there's a lot of discussions between these policymakers, but where does society or community, how does community engage with such decisions?
Well, they're not engaged. That's the thing. That's a problem. I think. I mean, especially around infrastructure development. Usually, some of the agencies, institutions have a lot of budget in building large-scale like flood protection, infrastructure, drainage. There's very little consultation. There's very little public participation.
Yes, Sumetee, please go ahead.
I don't know how to unmute myself.
I can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks. We found that a lot of times the communities that are most impacted by extreme events and such large projects, large urbanization scales, do not have the time to engage. They're really looking after their own lives to a large extent. They're highly vulnerable, and even asking them to give time for consultation often feels extractive. In these situations, we find that some cities are able to work with partners such as SDI or NGOs like COC in Cape Town, which have long-standing relations with community members. So they can be, as you said, Pakamas, there isn't budget allocated for communities participation, but one can put aside budget for incorporating institutions which bridge that informality and formality sectors in cities. And these we also term as knowledge brokers to some extent. So seeing their role as beyond servicing NGOs or being their voice, they're actually knowledge brokering. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. We do have a question to you, Sumetee, and from the. It says here, as cities are in transition, how partnerships across both horizontal and vertical governance are forged. From a South African experience, what good practices are there in Cape Town that have been applied, and any illustration would be great.
I think one of the examples that I just mentioned is involving NGOs or knowledge brokering institutions that are closer to communities is one good practice. The other is that we have research centers at, to my knowledge, institutions such as the University of Cape Town, which through their dedicated research centers on climate change and development, ACDI, have continued, even if researchers come and go, to engage on the same questions, similar questions. So funding from for research is utilized for holding these questions and engaging with both local government as well as communities. I don't know if that helps, but yeah, those are some examples. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I think we are coming to a close, unless there's any other questions. No, I don't see any other questions. We're coming to a close to this webinar, but I just want to thank so much to the panelists. Unless the panelists want to say any last parting words. Yeah, but if you'd like to find out more, there is the report, but also you can go to the profiles of the reader. I'm sure you can read their very rich literature of publication. But just to close this webinar, is to look at how difficult it is to provide governance and these institutional capacities for different scales of governments. It's not only just national, but also subnational scales, and instituting these types of changes and adapting to these kinds of changes, especially imposed by climate change, But I think one thing that I do want to add is that this interaction between society is important. So progress of technology is not the hardware itself, but also how it can interact with society. And that also influences this type of pace and scale of adoption of technology. So if I can draw this webinar to a close, yeah, just want to thank very much to the speakers for their time, and to also the people that have attended this webinar. I've been told there's quite a number of good turnouts, which was great. So thanks very much. This will be on record, so it can be available later as well for those who want to read. Thanks again, and on to the next